The Mediterranean, circa 1250 BCE. You are standing on a wooden deck. Salt spray hits your face. Around you, sailors haul rope and bark orders in a dozen different languages: Phoenician, Mycenaean Greek, Ugaritic, Cypriot. The hull groans beneath your feet. Cedar planks, cut from the mountains of Lebanon, shaped by craftsmen who have never seen the Nile, yet somehow serving the pharaoh. You are on a merchant vessel. Officially. Below deck, jars of resin, bolts of dyed linen, copper ingots shaped like stretched oxhide, trade goods, normal trade goods, the kind of cargo that moves between ports 100 times a season and nobody looks twice. But look again at the man near the stern, the one who doesn't touch the ropes, the one who watches every port you enter, every ship you pass, every face on every dock, the one who speaks 4 languages, not 2, not 3, 4, the one who writes things down when he thinks nobody is watching. Small marks on a strip of papyrus, rolled tight, tucked inside a sealed clay vessel. He is not a merchant. He is not a sailor. He works for the most powerful man on earth, and his only job is to know things. Here is what most people miss when they imagine ancient Egypt. They picture the pyramids rising from yellow sand. They picture the temples of Karnak, the gold mask of Tutankhamun, the colossal statues staring down from Abu Simbel. And yes, all of that is real. But what kept Egypt at the center of the ancient world for 3,000 years, not just powerful for a century, not dominant for a generation, but continuously at the top for 30 consecutive dynasties, wasn't simply bronze or gold or stone. It was information. And somewhere in a museum in Moscow sits a papyrus that most people have never heard of. Damaged, faded, written roughly 3,000 years ago. But what it describes, an Egyptian official operating alone in a foreign port, tracking ship movements, gathering intelligence, watching the political mood of local rulers shift in real time, reads less like an ancient travel document and more like a field agent's debriefing. We will come to that papyrus. But first, let me show you how an empire built on sand and stone became the ancient world's first information superpower. To understand Egypt's naval intelligence system, you first have to understand something that surprises almost everyone. Egypt was not naturally a maritime nation. Think about where Egyptian civilization actually grew, on the narrow green ribbon of the Nile Valley, pressed between 2 deserts. Egyptian boats were flat-bottomed river craft designed for calm water, predictable current, shallow shores. The Mediterranean was something entirely different. Deep water, violent storms, shifting winds, foreign coastlines that no Egyptian scribe had ever mapped. So why did Egypt care about the sea? Because the sea was where the wealth was. By the New Kingdom, roughly 1550 to 1070 BCE, Egypt had become the richest civilization on earth. The Pharaoh, whose name literally meant the Great House, sat at the center of a trade network that stretched from sub-Saharan Africa to the Greek islands. Ivory came up from Nubia. Lapis lazuli crossed 3,000 miles from the mountains of Afghanistan. Cedar came from Lebanon, enormous, straight-grained timber that Egypt desperately needed for ship hulls and temple roofs, because the palms that grow along the Nile simply do not bend the right way. Tin arrived from somewhere in the far north. Scholars still debate exactly where. Copper came from Cyprus. Oil and painted pottery from Mycenae. And from the mysterious land of Punt, on the Horn of Africa, myrrh resin and living frankincense trees so rare that Queen Hatshepsut dispatched a fleet of 5 large ships personally to retrieve them, then had every detail of the journey carved into the walls of her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari. All of this wealth moved through one corridor, the Eastern Mediterranean, and whoever controlled that corridor controlled the ancient world. But here is the problem no army could solve. The Mediterranean is not a border. You cannot patrol an ocean the way you patrol a river. There are hundreds of islands, dozens of major harbors, thousands of hidden coves where ships shelter from storms. Routes shift with the season. Alliances shift with the harvest. Control a port today, and tomorrow a rival city king opens a new one 40 miles down the coast. So the great pharaohs of the New Kingdom did something more intelligent than send warships. They stopped trying to control the water. They started controlling what moved through it. Stay with me. In 1887, an Egyptian woman digging in the ruins of Tel El Amarna, the short-lived desert capital built by the controversial pharaoh Akhenaten, found something she did not immediately recognize. A clay tablet, then another, then hundreds more, scattered in what had been the royal archive. Written not in Egyptian hieroglyphs, but in cuneiform, the wedge-pressed script used across the ancient Near East for diplomatic communication. These became known as the Amarna letters, and they are one of the most extraordinary historical finds ever made. The letters represent the active diplomatic archive of the Egyptian royal court during the reigns of Amenhotep III and Akhenaten, roughly 1390 to 1335 BCE. They contain correspondence between the pharaoh and the kings of Babylon, Assyria, Mitanni, the Hittites, Cyprus, and dozens of Canaanite city-states along the Levantine coast. Most history books treat them as evidence of Bronze Age diplomacy, polite letters between great kings, but pay attention to what the letters actually say. One Babylonian king mentions, almost in passing, that his grain reserves are running low, then asks for gold. A Canaanite city king writes urgently to warn the pharaoh that a neighboring ruler is secretly negotiating to switch sides. A coastal governor reports that unfamiliar foreign ships have been seen anchoring in harbors they have never used before. Someone on the ground noticed this. Someone was watching, and that observation traveled, somehow, through some network of contacts and couriers, all the way to the royal court of Egypt. The Amarna letters are not just diplomacy, they are an intelligence feed. And they show us something that most histories of Egypt skip entirely. The pharaohs of the New Kingdom ran one of the ancient world's most sophisticated information operations, hidden inside the ordinary traffic of trade and diplomacy that crisscrossed the Eastern Mediterranean every single day. But it gets stranger. Because we don't just have tablets and papyri, we have a wreck. In 1982, off the rocky southern coast of Turkey, near a cape called Uluburun, a Turkish sponge diver named Mehmet Çakır dove down to check his nets. He came back up with a story nobody believed at first. There was something on the seabed, something enormous. Archaeologists from the Institute of Nautical Archaeology spent 11 years excavating the site. 22,000 individual dives, and what they brought up from the seabed rewrote what we understood about Bronze Age trade. The Uluburun ship went down around 1300 BCE. Nobody knows exactly why. What was inside her hold has astonished historians ever since. 10 tons of Cypriot copper ingots, each one shaped like a stretched ox hide. A ton of tin, ebony logs from Central Africa. Glass ingots in deep cobalt blue, turquoise, and lavender raw glass, the kind only a royal workshop could process and afford. Ivory from both elephants and hippos, ostrich eggs. Baltic amber that had traveled more than 2,000 miles from the shores of what is now Poland or Denmark. Mycenaean pottery, Canaanite jewelry, weapons from the Aegean, a Canaanite merchant's cylinder seal. And this is the detail that has fascinated historians for 40 years, a golden scarab bearing the name of the Egyptian queen Nefertiti. Why would a golden scarab carrying a queen's name be inside a merchant vessel sailing the coast of Anatolia? Scholars have debated this for decades. The most compelling explanation is not that it was simply trade cargo. The most compelling explanation is that this vessel was operating, at least in part, under Egyptian royal patronage. That some of the people aboard this ship were not ordinary merchants. They were agents, moving under the cover of trade, watching every port they entered, noting which cities were growing, which were struggling, which harbor was suddenly busy with foreign warships. Think about what a merchant ship actually sees. Every port it enters, it sees the volume of trade. It sees which goods are plentiful and which are scarce. It watches which captains are nervous and which are confident. It hears conversations in warehouses, in taverns, on loading docks at dawn. It gathers, without effort, without suspicion, exactly the kind of information that a spy sent in official capacity could never access. A merchant ship sees everything, and nobody suspects the merchant. Now hold that thought, because there is one more piece of this story, and it is sitting in a glass case in Moscow. Around 1075 BCE, roughly a century after Uluburun sank, a mid-level Egyptian official named Wenemun was sent on what should have been a routine mission: travel to the Phoenician coast, purchase cedar for the sacred bark of the god Amun, return to Egypt. It did not go well. The account of his journey survives on papyrus. Scholars call it the Report of Wenemun, found in the late 19th century, now held in the Pushkin Museum in Moscow. If you read it expecting a dry administrative document, you will be wrong from the first paragraph. Wenemun's silver is stolen in a foreign port and the port authority does nothing. He is made to wait weeks before the local prince agrees to see him. He is questioned, delayed, nearly turned away entirely. The cedar he needs, cedar that Egypt once could simply demand as tribute, now has to be negotiated for, bargained over, paid for at market rates. And throughout all of this, Wenemun does something quietly remarkable. He watches. He tracks which ships are moving where. He listens to conversations between the local prince and his merchants. He reads the political atmosphere of every port he passes through, who still respects Egypt, who has quietly stopped, who is afraid, and who is merely pretending. He assesses the balance of power in the Eastern Mediterranean as it actually exists in this moment, not as the maps back in Egypt would suggest it should. The report of Wenemun is, on the surface, the humiliating story of an Egyptian official struggling to operate in a world that no longer fears Egypt. But underneath, it is something else entirely. It is the last surviving record of a system that once made Egypt untouchable. A system built on watching everything, knowing everything, having a man on every ship who wrote small marks on papyrus and tucked them inside sealed clay vessels and sent them home. That system was failing by Wenemun's time, but it had existed, and for centuries it had worked. Let me show you the moment it worked best. Ramesses III, 20th dynasty, approximately 1186 BCE. Egypt is facing the most serious external threat it has seen in generations. From the north and west, a confederation of displaced peoples that Egyptian scribes called the Sea Peoples are moving toward the Nile Delta. Modern archaeologists still debate exactly who they were, possibly refugees from the collapse of the Mycenaean world, possibly Anatolians driven south by drought, possibly a wave of peoples from the Aegean, from Anatolia, from the islands of the central Mediterranean. What is certain is that they had already destroyed civilizations far more powerful than Egypt expected. They burned Ugarit, one of the greatest trading cities of the ancient world. They dismantled the Hittite Empire, which had challenged Egypt for 2 centuries. They swept through Cyprus like fire through dry grass. Now they were moving toward the Nile, and Ramesses III was ready for them. How? How does a pharaoh, ruling from a palace 100 miles inland, know exactly where to position his fleet, in exactly the right kind of water, for exactly the right kind of battle? The answer is carved on the walls of Medinet Habu, the enormous mortuary temple Ramesses III built on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes. The reliefs there show the Battle of the Delta in extraordinary detail. Egyptian ships with archers positioned on raised platforms above the deck, Sea People's vessels with distinctive horned warriors fighting from the gunwales, men in the water, ships locked together, chaos ordered into decisive Egyptian victory. What those reliefs don't show, what carved stone cannot show, is the intelligence operation that made the victory possible. Ramesses III chose to fight in the shallow coastal lagoons of the Nile Delta. This was not luck. Egyptian flat-bottomed vessels could maneuver freely in those waters. The deeper-keeled foreign ships were restricted, slowed, unable to row effectively. The archers on Egyptian decks fired downward into enemy hulls. The geography turned a dangerous battle into a controlled slaughter. Someone had studied the enemy fleet and understood its weaknesses. Someone had tracked its approach from hundreds of miles away. Someone had reported its numbers, the design of its ships, its likely route, and Ramesses had used that information to choose his ground before the enemy even arrived. The Medjay were originally Nubian desert trackers, recruited by Egypt for their extraordinary skills in navigation, surveillance, and intelligence gathering across harsh terrain. By the New Kingdom, the Medjay had evolved into something more sophisticated, a networked force operating not just in the desert, but in ports, in foreign courts, embedded within the trade caravans and shipping lanes that crisscrossed the ancient world. By the time of Ramesses III, Medjay-trained agents operated in ports from Cyprus to the Libyan coast. When the Sea Peoples began their final movement south, those agents sent word, through merchants, through ship captains, through the invisible web of informants that Egypt had spent 500 years quietly weaving into the fabric of Mediterranean commerce. But here's what most people miss about Egypt's famous tolerance of foreigners. The Phoenician traders in Avaris, the Mycenaean craftsmen in Memphis, the Canaanite merchants in Pyramesses. Egypt welcomed them, gave them quarters, gave them market access, let them settle, intermarry, build temples to their own gods. This was not generosity, this was architecture. You let foreigners in so they feel safe, so they relax. So they drink wine and boast about their roots and their clients and the gossip from the last port they called at. And while they talk, the men around them listen. And what is heard gets written down. And what gets written down moves up the chain. There is one more thing worth understanding here. Egypt controlled not just the intelligence, but the interpretation. When a Canaanite city king sent a report to the pharaoh, he wrote it in cuneiform, the diplomatic script of the ancient world, not Egyptian, which means the Egyptian scribes who read it controlled the translation. They shaped how the pharaoh understood events in the outside world. They were not just bureaucrats. They were the architecture through which reality itself reached the throne. The scribes of Egypt were analysts, and the system they ran was the oldest continuous intelligence operation in human history. Around 1200 BCE, the world broke. Within 50 years, the span of 2 human generations, nearly every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean collapsed or contracted so severely it would never fully recover. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece burned and were not rebuilt. Ugarit was destroyed so completely that its population simply walked away and no one returned. The Hittite Empire, which had matched Egypt for 2 centuries, ceased to exist within a generation. Cyprus was disrupted. Trade routes that had operated for 500 years went silent. Historians call this the Bronze Age collapse. It remains one of the most debated events in the ancient world. The Sea Peoples were part of it. Climate data extracted from ice cores and tree rings shows a prolonged drought across the entire eastern Mediterranean beginning around 1200 BCE. Grain harvests failed. Political systems dependent on surplus food began to crack. Migrations followed famine, conflicts followed migrations. And in the deeply interconnected, trade-dependent world of the late Bronze Age, when one major node failed, others began to fail in sequence. But here is what most Egypt documentaries skip over. Egypt's maritime intelligence network was one of those nodes. When Ugarit burned, Egypt lost a critical intelligence station. When the Mycenaean palaces collapsed, the agents embedded in Aegean trade routes went silent. When the network of Canaanite city kings who had faithfully sent their reports to the pharaoh was swept away, the flow of information that had sustained Egyptian foreign policy for centuries stopped. Not slowly, not gradually, it just stopped. The K of the system, its animating force, the spirit that made it function, depended on the stability of the trade networks it was threaded through. When those networks broke, the intelligence network broke with them. Rameses III won his great naval battle. He celebrated it on the walls of Medinet Habu. He declared the victory of Ma'at over Isfet, of divine order over chaos. But it was the last great Egyptian naval victory for centuries. After him, the intelligence reports stopped coming. The agents in foreign ports either died, retired, or found new masters. The scribes who could read cuneiform became rarer. The merchants carrying Egyptian eyes and ears through 100 Mediterranean ports stopped sailing under Egyptian patronage. And then came Wenamun, one man, no network, no protection. Alone in a foreign port, with a sealed letter that nobody cared about anymore. What his papyrus captures, without ever saying it directly, is not simply the humiliation of one official. It is the silence where the network used to be. In the Egyptian understanding of the cosmos, Ma'at was the divine principle that held everything in balance. Truth, order, clarity of sight. The pharaoh's deepest obligation was to maintain Ma'at against the force of chaos. The intelligence network was, in a very real sense, how the pharaohs maintained Ma'at in the world beyond Egypt's borders. It was how they saw clearly, how they knew the truth of what was happening beyond the sand and the sea. When it fell, something deeper than political power was lost. The clarity was gone. Here is what I want you to carry with you from this. We live in an era saturated with information. Every phone is a listening post. Every click is a data point. Every transaction you make is tracked, analyzed, and fed into systems built to understand you better than you understand yourself. We call this modern. We call this unprecedented. But 3,000 years before the first algorithm, the pharaohs of Egypt had already discovered the truth that every lasting empire since has been forced to learn. Control the information, and you control the world. It wasn't their armies that made Egypt the longest lasting civilization in human history. Armies lose. Warriors age and die. It wasn't even their gold, though the gold of Nubia filled temples from one end of the Nile to the other. It was their ability to know while others guessed, to see clearly while others were fumbling in the dark, to have a quiet man on every merchant ship, in every foreign port, writing small marks on papyrus and sealing them into clay. And when that ability failed, when the network's nodes burned and the agents went silent and the reports stopped coming, the Egypt that had dominated the ancient world for 500 years began a slow, painful retreat from greatness. There is something quietly devastating about the final image of Wenemun. Here is a man who represents the oldest and proudest civilization on Earth. He is walking through ports that once trembled at the sound of the Pharaoh's name. He invokes the god Amun in cities that barely pause when they hear it. He negotiates for cedar wood from a Phoenician prince who makes him wait for weeks and eventually agrees only because it is commercially convenient. He gets his cedar, he makes it home. But the world he returns to is not the world that sent him. That world is already gone. And in a glass case in a museum in Moscow, on a damaged piece of papyrus written 3,000 years ago, the last echo of Egypt's intelligence empire sits quietly, watched by no one, having once known everything. The ancient Egyptians believed that to be forgotten was to truly die, to cease to exist not just in the body but in the Ka, the animating spirit that survives into the Duat, the world beyond this one. The pharaohs carved their names on every stone surface they could find. They built monuments intended to outlast time itself. They wanted to be seen, to be known, to survive. The irony is that Egypt's greatest instrument of survival was invisible. No carvings, no inscriptions, no stone monuments, just a quiet man near the stern of a ship, watching, writing, sending word home. The question I want to leave you with is this. In a world where information has always been the ultimate currency, where the ones who truly controlled power were never the ones with the biggest armies, but the ones who knew the most, who do you think is playing that role today? And do you think you would even know if you were the one being watched?